What if I told you that a single battle in the dusty plains of North India not only toppled a kingdom, but gave birth to one of the greatest empires in history? And what if I told you that this empire, forged in blood and ambition, would rise to control nearly all of the Indian subcontinent, dazzling the world with wealth, art, and unimaginable power, yet be torn apart by betrayal, faith, and relentless war? This is the story of the Mughal Empire. A dynasty that began with a young prince from Central Asia who marched with barely 12,000 men, and ended with a broken emperor fighting desperately to hold together a crumbling legacy. From Babur's thunderous cannons at Panipat to Aurangzeb's last desperate gamble, the saga of the Mughals is one of the most dramatic epics in world history. Stay with me, because what you are about to hear is not just history, it's the tale of ambition, betrayal, love, and war that shaped the very heart of South Asia. And if you think you know how it ends, wait until you discover the twists that even the emperors themselves never saw coming. The story of the Mughal Empire begins not in India, but far away in the windswept valleys and rugged mountains of Central Asia. It is the late 15th century, and the world is still haunted by the memory of Timur, the lame better known as Tamerlane. His armies had stormed across Asia, leaving behind burning cities and mountains of skulls. Timur's descendants, scattered across Central Asia, clung to fragments of his legacy, ruling small territories, while dreaming of the glory their ancestor had once commanded. Among them was a boy named Zahir-ad-Din Muhammad Babur, born in 1483, in the city of Andijan, in the Fergana Valley. Babur carried the blood of Timur through his father, and the blood of Genghis Khan through his mother, a double inheritance of conquest and empire. But at first, all he had was a fragile throne and endless enemies. By the age of 12, Babur was already a ruler, but he was also a fugitive, driven from his lands by rival warlords. Imagine a boy not yet in his teens, forced to flee from city to city, sleeping in mountain caves, gathering what few loyal men he could, and dreaming of one day claiming a kingdom worthy of his ancestors. That boy would become the founder of the Mughal Empire, but the road ahead was filled with betrayal, hardship, and battles that seemed impossible to win. A wanderer's dream, Babur first tried to seize the jewel of Central Asia, Samarkand. Twice he managed to capture it, and twice he lost it, betrayed by allies, outmaneuvered by rivals, starved by sieges. Each defeat left him weaker, but never broken. His memoirs, the Baburnama, reveal the heart of a man who refused to surrender. He wrote, not like a cold conqueror, but like a poet, describing gardens, rivers, and the taste of melons with the same intensity as the clash of swords. Yet, Babur knew that Central Asia was slipping from his grasp. The rising Uzbeks, under Shabani Khan, were too strong, and Babur was forced south, into Kabul. Here, he built a new base. The city became his refuge, his fortress, and his laboratory for future conquest. From Kabul, Babur gazed eastward, across the Hindu Kush, toward the rich plains of Hindustan. India was not unknown to him. Traders brought back stories of its immense wealth, of cities bursting with people, of armies glittering with elephants. But Babur also knew that India was politically fractured. The once mighty Delhi Sultanate had grown weak and divided. Ruled by Ibrahim Lodi, a sultan mistrusted even by his own nobles. For a man with ambition, India was both a temptation and an opportunity. The march to Panipat in 1526, Babur made his move. He gathered an army small, by Indian standards, only around 12,000 men, but disciplined, loyal, and armed with something that would change the course of Indian warfare forever: gunpowder artillery. Have you ever wondered how sometimes it is not the size of an army, but the innovation behind it that decides the fate of nations? Babur's cannons, hauled over mountains and rivers, gave him a weapon no Indian ruler had yet mastered. When Babur's forces marched into India, Sultan Ibrahim Lodi raised an army said to number over 100,000, with nearly 1,000 war elephants. The odds seemed absurd. A Central Asian prince, with a ragged army of 12,000, stood against a sultan commanding the might of North India. It looked like certain death. But Babur was no ordinary commander. He knew the land, he understood discipline, and above all, he trusted in the power of his cannons. On the morning of April 21, 1526, on the fields of Panipat, two armies faced each other in a moment that would decide the future of India. The First Battle of Panipat. The battlefield stretched across dusty plains under a burning sun. Ibrahim Lodi's elephants roared, their tusks fitted with iron tips, their backs carrying archers and spearmen. His infantry stretched in endless lines, a sea of men ready to crush the invaders. Babur, calm but resolute, had prepared something the Indians had never seen. He arranged his men behind carts, linked with chains, forming a barricade. Between these carts, he placed his cannons and matchlocked men. His cavalry, fast and disciplined, waited on the flanks. When the battle began, Lodi's massive army surged forward. The ground shook beneath the charge of elephants, dust filled the air, and the thunder of drums echoed across the plain. And then Babur's cannons roared. The elephants, terrified by the explosions and smoke, panicked, trampling their own troops. The tight formations of Ibrahim Lodi's army collapsed into chaos. Babur's cavalry swept in, striking the disordered enemy from the sides. By midday, the great army of the Delhi Sultan had disintegrated. Ibrahim Lodi himself fell on the field, abandoned and defeated. In a single day, with a force a fraction the size of his enemy, Babur had not only won, but had opened the gates of India to a new dynasty. The birth of the Mughal Empire, standing on the field of Panipat, surrounded by the dead and the dust of victory. Babur knew this was more than just a triumph. It was the beginning of something far greater. The Delhi Sultanate was shattered, and the path to empire lay before him. But conquest is never the end of the story, is only the beginning. Babur now faced the impossible task of holding together a land he had barely begun to understand. India was vast, diverse, and restless, and in the years to come, he would fight not just to expand his rule, but to survive against endless rebellions, rival kings, and the very climate that seemed hostile to his Central Asian heart. Yet from this single battle, the Mughal Empire was born, an empire that would grow to dominate India for the next 3 centuries. And here lies the question that will guide our journey. How did a wandering prince, with nothing but dreams and a handful of men, build one of the richest and most powerful empires in history? The answer lies not just in battles and blood, but in the visions, choices, and gambles of the emperors who followed men who would shape art, culture, and faith as much as war. But as we will see, with every dazzling achievement came shadows that would one day consume the empire from within. Victory at Panipat had given Babur the throne of Delhi, but what he left behind was not an empire, it was a precarious conquest. Babur ruled only 5 years in India before his sudden death in 1530, leaving the burden of this fragile realm on the shoulders of his eldest son. Humayun was brave, cultured, and deeply loyal to his father's legacy, but he was also indecisive, more dreamer than ruler, a man who often placed trust where suspicion was needed. He inherited not a united India, but a patchwork of restless nobles, ambitious Afghan chiefs, and rival sultans waiting for the chance to reclaim their lands. The Mughal throne was still wet with blood, and its new emperor was untested. And so begins one of the most dramatic chapters in the Mughal saga, the fall of Humayun, and the unbelievable rise of a child emperor, who would one day be remembered as Akbar, the great brothers at war from the very start. Humayun's greatest threat did not come from outside enemies, it came from within his own family. Babur had divided lands among his sons, a decision that would prove fatal. Humayun's brothers, especially Kamran and Hindal, were ambitious, jealous, and unwilling to bow before him. Imagine trying to rule a kingdom where your own brothers refused to recognize you as sovereign. One moment they would pledge loyalty, the next they would conspire with your enemies, instead of uniting against common foes. The Mughal princes dragged their empire into fratricidal wars. Humayun, perhaps too kind-hearted, forgave them again and again. Each pardon, however, weakened him, emboldening rivals and eroding the respect of his nobles. As rebellions flared and wars broke out, one name began to rise, a man whose genius and ruthlessness would soon shake the Mughal throne to its core. The rise of Sher Shah. His name was Sher Khan, later known as Sher Shah Suri. He was no prince of royal blood, no descendant of Timur or Genghis Khan. He was an Afghan of humble origins, a soldier who clawed his way up through cunning, bravery, and a gift for strategy. Where Humayun hesitated, Sher Shah struck with lightning precision. Where Humayun forgave, Sher Shah demanded absolute obedience. By the early 1540s, Sher Shah had carved out his own kingdom in Bihar and Bengal. Humayun, underestimating him, marched east to crush this upstart. What followed was one of the most humiliating defeats in Mughal history. At the Battle of Chausa, in 1539, Humayun's forces were outmaneuvered, his camp thrown into chaos, and he himself barely escaped drowning in the Ganges. A year later, at Kanauj, disaster struck again. Humayun's army collapsed, his empire dissolved, and the Mughal dream seemed finished. Sher Shah Suri rode triumphantly into Delhi, proclaiming himself ruler of Hindustan. And Humayun, the emperor of India, became a fugitive, wandering through deserts and hostile lands, betrayed by allies, shunned by nobles, clinging only to a small band of loyal followers. The long exile: what happens when an emperor has no empire? Humayun's story now turned into one of survival. For 15 years, he wandered in exile. He begged refuge from distant courts, even as his brothers betrayed him repeatedly. His once loyal nobles deserted him, his treasury vanished, and his name became a memory whispered only in poetry and prayer. At one point, Humayun fled through the Thar desert with his pregnant wife, Hamida, Banu Begum. With no food and only a few drops of water, he staggered across the burning sands, pursued by enemies. In that moment of despair, it seemed the Mughal line would end, not in glory, but in thirst and oblivion. And yet, this journey through the desert gave birth to hope. Amidst suffering and exile, Hamida gave birth to a son, in 1542. The child's name was Jalaluddin Muhammad. Few could have imagined that this fragile infant, born in a tent while his parents fled for their lives, would one day rule half of India and be called Akbar the Great. But the road to Akbar's throne was still covered in shadows. For now, Humayun remained a king without a kingdom. Fortunes turned meanwhile. Sher Shah Suri proved himself not only a conqueror but also a remarkable ruler. He built roads, established postal networks, reformed taxes, and laid down the foundations of efficient governance. Even today, India's Grand Trunk Road traces back to his vision. But his reign was cut short. In 1545, he died in a tragic accident when an exploding cannon claimed his life. His successors were weak, and his empire quickly unraveled. The throne of Delhi, once again, stood vulnerable, waiting for someone bold enough to seize it. In 1555, after years of exile, Humayun returned with Persian support. Against all odds, he recaptured Delhi. The Mughal flag once again flew over India. But fate, so often cruel to Humayun, struck one final blow. Barely a year after regaining his throne, he fell to his death slipping on the marble steps of his library while carrying an armful of books. An emperor undone, not by sword or cannon, but by chance. Humayun was gone, and the empire's survival now rested on the shoulders of his 13-year-old son, the boy who would be emperor. Imagine the scene: a child, not yet a man, standing in the halls of Delhi, proclaimed emperor of Hindustan. Around him, ambitious generals, suspicious nobles, and opportunistic enemies waited, certain that the Mughal dynasty would collapse once more. That child was Akbar. He had seen exile, hunger, and fear. He had watched his father humbled, betrayed, and restored. And now, barely into his teens, he faced the impossible task of ruling an empire surrounded by enemies. His regent and mentor, the loyal Bairam Khan, guided his early steps. But the boy himself soon revealed qualities no one had expected: ruthless determination, uncanny judgment, and a vision that stretched far beyond mere survival. The stage was set for one of the most astonishing transformations in history. From the ashes of defeat and exile, from the weakness of Humayun's reign, would rise a ruler who would not only restore the Mughal Empire, but expand it into a golden age. A dynasty at the crossroads, as Akbar ascended the throne in 1556. The Mughal destiny hung by a thread. Enemies closed in from every side. The Afghan remnants plotted revenge. Rajput chiefs prepared for war, and even his own court simmered with intrigue. Few believed the boy emperor would last a year. But history has a way of surprising us. For while Babur had won India with cannons and courage, and Humayun had nearly lost it to weakness and misfortune, it would be Akbar who mastered not only the battlefield but the art of ruling hearts and minds. And yet, the story of Akbar's rise begins not in a palace or a court, but on a battlefield where a teenage emperor, facing enemies determined to crush him, made a stand that would change the fate of India forever. Picture this: a 13-year-old boy standing in the chaos of a war-torn empire. His father dead, his dynasty weakened, and enemies circling like vultures. That boy was Akbar. In 1556, when he inherited the throne, the Mughal Empire was nothing more than a fragile shell, held together by hope and loyalty to a family name. Few believed he would survive. The Afghan Sur dynasty, though weakened after Sher Shah's death, was not finished. Their leader, Humayun, ambitious general, who had risen from a humble background, gathered a massive army. He was brilliant, ruthless, and determined to drive the Mughals out of India once and for all. Against him stood Akbar, barely a teenager, guided by his regent and protector, Bayram Khan. The moment of truth came at the Second Battle of Panipat. The Second Battle of Panipat, a foggy November morning in 1556. Two armies faced each other. On the fields near Panipatha, same ground where Babur had carved his place in history 30 years before. But this time, the stakes were even higher. His army boasted over 30,000 cavalry and a terrifying array of war elephants. By contrast, Akbar's Mughal forces were fewer, commanded by Bayram Khan, while the young emperor waited in the rear. If Humayun won, the Mughal dynasty would end in its infancy. The battle raged fiercely. At first, Humayun's elephants and cavalry crushed the Mughal lines. Victory seemed within his grasp. Then fate intervened. An arrow struck Humayun in the eye, piercing through to his brain. Though still alive, he collapsed in his howdah, and his army, seeing their leader fall, wavered. The Mughals surged back, routing the Afghan forces. When the dust settled, the boy Emperor Akbar had survived his trial by fire. The Mughal dynasty had been saved not by chance alone, but by the resilience of a young ruler who refused to be extinguished. And yet, what would truly set Akbar apart was not just his survival on the battlefield, but the vision he carried for the empire he was destined to shape. A vision beyond the sword. Akbar's early reign was turbulent. Nobles quarreled, provinces rebelled, and enemies tested his strength. But from the start, Akbar revealed an instinct few rulers ever possessed: the ability to see beyond the sword. Have you ever wondered what makes a ruler truly great? Is it conquest, or is it the ability to rule people, not as subjects, but as partners? Akbar seemed to understand that India's strength lay in its diversity. Hindus, Muslims, Jains, Sikhs, millions lived under his rule, each with their own traditions and beliefs. Instead of crushing them, he sought to embrace them. He began by marrying into powerful Rajput families, forging alliances where his predecessors had waged war. One such marriage, to the daughter of Raja Barmal of Amber, not only secured his western flank, but also symbolized a new era of cooperation between Mughals and Rajputs. Akbar went further. He abolished the hated jizya tax on non-Muslims, welcomed Hindu nobles into his court, and listened to scholars of all faiths. His palace at Fatehpur Sikri became a center of debate, where Sufis, Hindu pundits, Christian priests, and even Jesuit missionaries from Europe gathered to discuss philosophy and religion. In a land divided by centuries of conquest and suspicion, Akbar's inclusiveness was revolutionary. It was not weakness, but strength, the foundation of an empire that would outshine all others in wealth, stability, and culture. The conqueror who outgrew conquest, but make no mistake, Akbar was still a conqueror. His armies expanded the Mughal Empire in all directions. He subdued Gujarat, captured Bengal, crushed Afghan rebels, and extended his dominion deep into central India. Yet what set him apart was his restraint. Unlike many conquerors, Akbar did not see victory merely as plunder. He built cities, established a fair system of taxation, and reformed administration, so that both peasant and noble could thrive. He understood that to rule India, one needed more than soldiers, one needed justice. He introduced the Mansabdari system, a clever blend of military and civil ranking, which bound nobles to him with both responsibility and reward. He restructured land revenue, ensuring peasants were not crushed under endless taxes. These reforms turned the Mughal Empire into one of the most efficient states of its time. admired even by Europeans who marveled at its wealth and order. And still, Akbar's ambitions were not only earthly, they reached into the realm of ideas. Din-i Ilahi, the emperor's spiritual gamble in the latter years of his reign. Akbar's curiosity about faith took a bold turn. Surrounded by priests, monks, and mystics, he began to question rigid divisions between religions. Could there be, he wondered, a truth that transcended them all? In 1582, he founded the Din-i Ilahi, or Religion of God, a spiritual movement that sought to merge elements of Islam, Hinduism, Christianity, and Zoroastrianism. Few actually joined, and many Muslims saw it as heresy. But the very attempt reveals Akbar's restless, daring mind. What other emperor in history would risk alienating his own religious elite to pursue a vision of universal harmony? Some saw madness, others saw genius. But either way, it was Akbar's relentless search for unity that defined his reign. The Golden Throne by the time Akbar's reign matured. The Mughal Empire stretched from the Hindu Kush to the Bay of Bengal, from the Deccan Plateau to the deserts of Rajasthan. His court glittered with wealth. His patronage gave rise to miniature paintings of breathtaking beauty, to architecture like the palaces of Fetehpur Sikri, to a cultural renaissance that fused Persian elegance with Indian artistry. But perhaps his greatest legacy was not what he built, but what he left behind, an empire whose foundation was strong enough to endure for generations. And yet beneath the glory, shadows began to stir. For even as Akbar dreamed of unity, his heirs and generals whispered of power. His court, rich and dazzling, also brimmed with intrigue, and the seeds of conflict sown in these years would one day test his descendants in ways even Akbar could not foresee. The great question is, Akbar aged, his empire stood at its zenith. He had turned a fragile dynasty into a golden empire. He had forged bonds between enemies, and he had dared to think beyond conquest. But a question lingered: what happens when a vision greater than one man rests in the hands of those who do not share it? The answer would emerge in the reigns of his successors: his son Jahangir, the lover of wine and art; his grandson Shah Jahan, who built the Taj Mahal; and ultimately, Aurangzeb, whose last gamble would bring the empire to its breaking point. But before we reach the empire's twilight, we must first explore its golden glow, the courts of Jahangir and Shah Jahan, where beauty and power reached heights never seen before, and where the fate of the empire was quietly being sealed. When Akbar the Great died in 1605, the empire he left behind stretched wider and stood taller than any India had seen in centuries. His son Salim, crowned as Jahangir, inherited a throne that glowed with prosperity, but also trembled with expectations. How do you follow a ruler like Akbar, a man who had bent kingdoms and religions to his will, who had crafted an empire out of chaos? For Jahangir, the answer was complicated. He was not his father. He lacked Akbar's relentless vision and iron discipline. Instead, Jahangir was a man of contradictions, charming yet unpredictable, an aesthete who loved gardens, art, and poetry, yet also a ruler who fell prey to excess and manipulation. From the very start, his reign was marked by rebellion. Even before Akbar's death, Salim had revolted against his father. Now, as emperor, he carried both the weight of guilt and the hunger to prove himself worthy. But history would remember Jahangir, not only for his own flaws, but for the power behind his throne, one of the most remarkable women in Mughal history. The rise of Nur Jahan in 1611 Jahangir married Maranisa, a Persian widow of extraordinary beauty, intelligence, and ambition. She would become known as Nur Jahan, the light of the world. Nur Jahan was no ordinary empress. Unlike most queens of her age, she wielded real political power. She issued imperial orders, minted coins in her own name, and sat beside Jahangir in court. In many ways, she became the true ruler of the empire, while Jahangir drifted into indulgence, particularly his love of wine and opium. But Nur Jahan was also shrewd. She built alliances, promoted her family into positions of power, and managed the empire's affairs with decisiveness. For a time, she and Jahangir ruled as a formidable pair, the emperor and his queen, their portraits immortalized in art, their names spoken together in awe. Yet, behind the shimmering facade, cracks widened. Princes competed for succession. Nobles plotted in secret, and as Jahangir grew weaker, his court became a nest of vipers, waiting for the moment to strike. The succession struggle, one of the fiercest rivalries of Jahangir's reign, lay within his own family. His sons, Khusro, Khurram, and Shah, each hungered for the throne. Khusro rebelled early and was brutally punished, blinded, imprisoned. A tragic figure whose fate foreshadowed the bloodshed that succession struggles would bring. Prince Khurram, more ambitious and calculating, would later be known as Shah Jahan. He won military glory, expanded the empire's frontiers, and gradually emerged as Jahangir's strongest heir. But even his rise was not without betrayal. For a time, he clashed with Nur Jahan, whose support shifted toward Shah, Jahangir's youngest son and her own son-in-law. The Mughal throne, built on conquest and vision, was now threatened not by enemies beyond the empire, but by the rivalries festering within. When Jahangir died in 1627, the struggle for succession exploded into violence. Through cunning, force, and loyalty from key nobles, Prince Khurram triumphed. The rivals were eliminated. Shahryar was executed, and Khurram ascended the throne as Shah Jahan, the king of the world. Shah Jahan, the king of marble and might. Shah Jahan's reign marked the Mughal Empire's peak of splendor. Under him, the empire expanded its frontiers. Its coffers overflowed with wealth, and its culture reached heights that dazzled the world. But Shah Jahan was more than a conqueror. He was a dreamer in stone. His reign became synonymous with architecture, with monuments that blended Persian elegance and Indian creativity into structures that seemed to defy time itself. The Red Fort in Delhi, the Jama Masjid, and above all the Taj Mahal. And at the heart of his legacy lies one of the most famous love stories in history. The love of Shah Jahan and Mumtaz Mahalajmand, Banu Begum, better known as Mumtaz Mahal, was not Shah Jahan's first wife, but she was his only true love. Their bond was legendary. She accompanied him even on military campaigns, advising him, comforting him, sharing his burdens. She bore him 14 children, and despite the trials of power, their devotion never waned. But in 1631, tragedy struck. During the birth of their 14th child, Mumtaz Mahal died. Shah Jahan, devastated beyond words, withdrew from the world. For days, he refused food, his hair turned white prematurely, and his grief transformed into an obsession to build a monument that would immortalize their love. And so rose the Taj Mahal, a mausoleum of white marble that shimmered under moonlight, its domes and minarets a testament to eternal devotion. 20,000 workers, artisans, and architects toiled for over 2 decades to complete it. Diamonds, jade, turquoise, and lapis lazuli were inlaid into marble like frozen drops of starlight. Even today, the Taj Mahal stands not merely as a tomb, but as a story carved into stone, the story of a man who built the world's most beautiful monument out of grief, power, and shadows. But while the Taj Mahal sparkled, shadows darkened the empire. The very wealth and power that Shah Jahan enjoyed also fueled unrest. Wars drained the treasury, rival factions jostled for influence, and the question of succession loomed once again. Shah Jahan had 4 surviving sons: Darashid, the scholar prince, who embraced tolerance and philosophy; Aurangzeb, the hard-edged general, driven by faith and ambition; Shuja, the opportunistic governor of Bengal; and Murad, the reckless adventurer. What happens when 4 princes, each with armies and ambition, fight for the peacock throne? The answer, as history would soon show, was blood. As Shah Jahan's health declined, his sons prepared for war. The empire, at the height of its glory, teetered on the brink of civil war, a war that would decide not only the future of the dynasty, but the very soul of the Mughal Empire. The empire's golden dusk. Shah Jahan, the emperor who had built wonders, now faced the tragedy of betrayal from within his own family. His love for Dara Shikoh clashed with Aurangzeb's relentless hunger for power, and when the storm of succession broke, the Mughal Empire would never be the same. The golden age of marble and art, of poets and gardens, would soon give way to the clang of steel and the roar of cannons. And waiting in the shadows was Aurangzeb, a prince who would gamble everything: his brothers, his father, and even the empire itself, for the throne of Hindustan. The year was 1657. Emperor Shah Jahan, master builder of the Taj Mahal, fell gravely ill. Whispers spread through the palace corridors. The emperor was dying. His sons, each commanding armies, saw their moment. Dara Shikoh, Shah Jahan's beloved heir, was a scholar and philosopher who dreamed of reconciling Hinduism and Islam. He translated the Upanishads into Persian and spoke of unity. Many saw him as the natural heir to Akbar's vision of tolerance. Aurangzeb, his younger brother, was the opposite, a hardened general, deeply pious, uncompromising, and ruthless. To him, Dara was weak, indulgent, even heretical. Between these two brothers, the fate of the empire would be decided. Two more princes, Shuja in Bengal and Murad in Gujarat, also declared their claims. The Mughal Empire, at the height of its wealth and power, descended into one of the bloodiest succession wars in history. The betrayal of Aurangzeb was a master of strategy. At first he allied with Murad, using his brother's ambition to strengthen his own hand. Meanwhile, Dara relied on his father's support, believing loyalty and legitimacy would shield him. But loyalty is a fragile thing when thrones are at stake. In 1658, on the plains of Samyugar, near Agra, the brothers clashed. Dara's army was larger, glittering with war elephants and artillery. But Aurangzeb was cunning. He feigned retreat, lured Dara into overconfidence, and then unleashed a devastating counterattack. By sunset, Dara's army was shattered. The scholar prince fled in disguise, leaving Aurangzeb, victorious Murad. Once Aurangzeb's ally, soon found himself betrayed, arrested, and executed when he was no longer useful. Shuja, too, was hunted down, fleeing into Burma, where he vanished into legend, and Dara, after months of flight, he was captured. In one of the most infamous moments of Mughal history, Aurangzeb had his brother paraded through Delhi in chains, mocked by the very people who once admired him. Soon after, Dara was executed, branded a heretic. The blood of brothers stained the peacock throne. The imprisoned emperor with his rivals eliminated. Aurangzeb turned on his father. Shah Jahan, once the most powerful man in India, was placed under house arrest in the Agra fort for 8 long years. The builder of the Taj Mahal lived as a prisoner, gazing from his window at the shining monument he had built for his beloved Mumtaz. When Shah Jahan finally died in 1666, he was buried beside Mumtaz in the Taj Mahal, the very symbol of love, now also a tomb of betrayal. Unchallenged, ruled as the undisputed emperor. But his triumph came at a cost. For the very methods that brought him to power would one day undo his empire. Aurangzeb's gambler was brilliant, disciplined, and devout. He expanded the empire further than any Mughal before him, pushing into the Deccan, crushing kingdoms, and stretching Mughal rule from the Himalayas to the southern seas. His armies were unmatched, his administration efficient, his treasury swollen with conquest. And yet Aurangzeb's reign carried a fatal flaw. Unlike Akbar, who sought unity through tolerance, Aurangzeb imposed orthodoxy. He reimposed the jizya tax on non-Muslims, destroyed certain temples, and alienated the Rajputs, who had once been the empire's strongest allies. Have you ever wondered how empires collapse? Sometimes not from enemies, but from within, when the bonds that hold people together are broken. Aurangzeb's policies sowed resentment across the land. Hindus, Sikhs, Marathas, even Shia Muslims all began to resist. The endless war. Aurangzeb spent the last decades of his reign locked in ceaseless war. The greatest of these was against the Marathas, led by the legendary Shivaji, and later his successors. Shivaji, through guerrilla tactics and audacious raids, humiliated the mighty Mughal armies. His coronation as Chhatrapati in 1674 symbolized open defiance to Mughal authority. In the north, the Sikhs under Guru Gobind Singh resisted fiercely, forging a martial identity that would one day shape India's destiny. In the Deccan, kingdoms rebelled again and again, draining Mughal wealth and manpower. Aurangzeb, obsessed with conquest, spent nearly 30 years camped in the Deccan. Far from his capital, his empire stretched vast, but it was like a bow pulled too tight, ready to snap. The emperor Alonas, Aurangzeb, aged. His victories grew hollow. The treasury emptied. Rebellions multiplied. His generals grew weary. His sons, like those before him, schemed for succession. In his final years, the once mighty emperor wrote letters filled with despair. "I came alone into this world," he confessed, "and alone I shall depart." Unlike his forefathers, he built no grand tomb, no shining legacy of marble. When he died in 1707, after nearly 50 years on the throne, he asked for a simple grave, covered only with earth, and so ended the reign of Aurangzeb, the last great Mughal emperor. The fall of the empire with Aurangzeb's death, the Mughal Empire began its long decline. His successors, weaker and divided, inherited a realm exhausted by war. Nobles carved out their own fiefdoms, provinces slipped from control, and new powers rose: the Marathas, the Sikhs, the British. The peacock throne, once a symbol of unmatched power, became a prize for invaders. In 1739, Nader Shah of Persia stormed Delhi, looting its treasures and carrying away the throne itself. A century later, the British would reduce the Mughal emperor to a puppet, until finally, after the revolt of 1857, the dynasty was abolished altogether. From Babur's daring gamble at Panipat to Aurangzeb's lonely death in the Deccan, the Mughal story had spanned nearly 2 centuries, an empire of glory and blood, tolerance and tyranny, love and betrayal. The legacy of the Mughal sand, yet, even in decline, the Mughal legacy endures. In the domes of the Taj Mahal, in the paintings of miniature artists, in the poetry of Persian and Urdu, in the gardens and palaces that still stand across India and Pakistan, the echoes of the Mughals live on. But perhaps the greatest lesson of their story is this: empires are not built by swords alone, nor do they fall by swords alone. They rise on vision, on unity, on the choices of men who dare to gamble everything. And when those choices divide rather than unite, even the mightiest throne can crumble into dust. So ask yourself what truly holds power together: fear, faith, or love? For the Mughals, the answer shifted with each emperor, and in that shifting lies the story of their glory and their fall.